Oh man, I am so excited to be back with you all. This is the second, call it season of this podcast. And I thought in this season, we would spend some time focusing on, the entrepreneurial struggle around raising capital to fund the growth of your business. It's, I think, one of the more difficult things to do. It's one of the more difficult things I've done in building a business. And I thought we would kick this off with one of my dearest and oldest friends in the consumer products business, and someone who I consider an expert when it comes to this process, my good friend, Andy Whitman. Andy, thanks for being with us today.
Hey there. I don't know about the expert, but I'm glad to share whatever thoughts I've got.
Well, we appreciate you being with us. Andy, just for context, just so everyone knows, will you give us the quick sort of elevator pitch on yourself?
Sure. So I'm not an investment banker or consultant by background. Those are great backgrounds. That's just not a movie I can play on TV. I'm an operator by background. I started my career at what used to be General Foods. In its heyday, General Foods was a Dow 30 stock. It eventually bought Kraft. Somebody was smart enough to say that Kraft is probably a better company name than General Foods. And I was in that organization, 13, 14 years. It was great. I did a little bit of everything. I was quite the mutt by big company standards. But what I loved doing was working on what I affectionately called the SLBs, the shitty little businesses, the ones that were too big for a $20 or $40 billion multinational, but maybe Jason and Andy Incorporated would like to own personally. They were generally high margin businesses, decent cash flow, but they were all challenged for one reason or another. Today, we'd call them orphan brands. Anyway, I loved it. I was in functional roles and then, running business groups. And what I loved was the fact that we were in real businesses. We had real plants. We had real sales forces. They were a little less integrated than, most big companies. And over that time, I had a bunch of observations, some on sort of the corporate side and some on the investor side, because it's pretty unusual, especially back then, to get exposure to the private equity world. So the observations fell in two buckets. On the corporate side, big companies are good at so many things. The most notable two things they're not good at is they don't have a lot of patience, and they're not really good at 0 to 100 million in revenue. They're great at 100 million to $1 billion. So that's the corporate side. On the investor side, they're also not doing small businesses. They weren't then, and as a broad overstatement, still aren't. Small businesses are nonlinear, which can mean messy. You can't write a large check if you're a large investor in a small company. So for a lot of reasons, the big companies needed a farm system, to use that analogy, and the investor world needed a farm system. So somehow that ended up being me. So in July of this year, will be celebrating 25 years of investing in and helping emerging brands in CPG only. So that's sort of how I got here.
25 years.
Yeah, makes me old.
It makes you a pioneer. And
true.
Yeah, I think it makes you a pioneer in the space. And think about what the emerging consumer products brands looked like 25 years ago versus what the landscape looks like today.
Oh, yeah, really different. Expo is coming up, and Expo, the main floor at Expo was not full, and the downstairs wasn't built yet, and the other several buildings hadn't built yet. So, using that as a calibration, this monster innovation engine in emerging brands, was a fraction of what it is today. And the products are better today is a broad overstatement. The entrepreneurs are more sophisticated, broad overstatement. And it's great, but it is night and day. I think this is 30 plus years of me going to Expo.
Wow. Well, this is my 12th Expo. So not quite half of your tenure. And I've seen that landscape evolved significantly even in my time, but I just can't imagine what it looked like 12 years before.
I
And,
think it's been interesting.
and we'll go out there, and there'll be 90,000 people trying to cram into Anaheim.
Yeah.
Sort
and
of
at least they're all, appropriately dressed. 30 plus years ago, people were in shorts and flip flops and,
Well, I wrote about this recently, that the natural products industry was very much, I don't want to use a derogatory term, but it was kind of hippie. It was kind of this like free spirit, kind of movement. But something happened like in the last 15 years that really like tipped the scales. I
think that's right. A lot of credit goes to a handful of pioneers. One example was Steve Demos, that was the founder of Silk. He had a neat little, hippie business. And he said, if we really want to be an alternative to milk, we need to taste closer to milk and look more like milk. And the product has, over the years, and I'm not talking the last 5, but, 2 or 3 decades ago, product dramatically improved. And instead of just being in the aseptic box in the middle of the store in the hippie, crunchy granola, natural food stores, they put them into gable top refrigerated containers and moved them over next to milk. And now it's sold everywhere. So, that's just an interesting benchmark. That happened probably 30 years ago.
Wow.
But it took a while for it to become mainstream.
Yeah, I think so. I wrote a little piece on LinkedIn, and I was trying to connect the dots between this like cult like CrossFit movement that came out of people's garages 10 or 15 years ago. And then you had these, this paleo trend that led into Whole30 and keto. And the amount of brands born out of that, right? So take the guys like Steve, who sort of like paved the initial way to say, hey, look, an alternative to what's traditionally out there can work. And then, and then you get this like movement of people who are really passionate about, holistic and ethical agriculture. And you look at people who care about the ingredients, and then it just became a big movement that has just sort of thrust forward. And then, to the credit of some of these really great entrepreneurs, the big consumer products companies like Kraft and General Mills and ConAgra and so forth have had to take notice and either pivot their own internal strategies or acquire some of these brands as they reach a little bit of scale and maturity and try to roll them in.
Yeah, there's been different studies over the years that quantify what you're talking about, but repeatedly what it shows is the big brands are representing a slightly smaller piece of the puzzle, and the emerging brands, while they're relatively small in the grand scheme of life, are more than 100% of the growth. So they're both sourcing and cannibalizing the existing, legacy brands, if you want to call it that, and representing more than 100% of the sort of growth in the industry.
Wow. That's pretty remarkable to see. I love just being in the middle of it.
It's a fun place to be with a lot of energy.
No doubt. So one of the hardest things to do when you're an incumbent or an emerging brand or a young entrepreneur and you got a great idea and you need to take your product to market, you are marketing and selling next to multinational, multi-billion-dollar conglomerates in many cases. So it takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of money to compete in that space. So this conversation is lively. And Andy, the last couple of years, would you agree with the statement that access to capital for entrepreneurs in this space has been challenged?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I'd break it down in 2 or 3 buckets. I think there was a tremendous amount of money that came in from outside the space. And when things got a little wonky, that money ran away. So just the total pool of capital diminished dramatically. I think that's number one. Number two, while I was never a big fan of it, as you know, there was a grow at any cost mentality from a number of entrepreneurs, maybe led by a number of investors, including some of the investors that came from outside the space. So again, there's no pointing of fingers, but I think it's rational to look at there was a bit of growth at any cost and fundamentals don't really matter. I was never a fan of fundamentals don't matter. It's not sexy, but it's really important. So I think there was a bit of that. I think the people that were committed to the space, that have been in the space, have always and continue to be committed to the space. I think they also were focused somewhat on their portfolio because COVID impacted everybody. Sometimes it impacted top line. Occasionally, some businesses like hand sanitizers and other things got huge booms. And sometimes businesses hit rough patches. But more than anything else, it consumed a lot of cash, supply chain disruptions, whatever. So there were a lot of people that had to be appropriately focused on their portfolio. So for lots of reasons, including those three or whatever I just articulated, there certainly was a shortage of capital. And I think the biggest of which is there had been a huge influx of capital that went away.
Got it. Do you think that capital that has been sitting on the sidelines then for the past couple of years, just your opinion, everyone's got one of these, but what do you think about the next couple of years? Do you think it will be the same, or do you think that more capital will free up? What do you think that looks like?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely more capital coming, but I think it's going to be the next normal, not a new normal. I think things will evolve, and I think fundamentals matter. I think ability to scale matters. And you and I have talked about the fact that just because something can be an interesting business or even a great business doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a great investment. And that's a huge difference. I think, yes, there will be more capital and there will certainly be more M&A activity from the larger companies. But I don't think, as a broad overstatement, large companies are ever going to buy $25 million revenue businesses again in regular order.
Yeah.
I don't think they should have the first time. They're too small.
Because they're just not good at that, right? That's just not what they're good at. Yeah. Those brands just get lost in the fold, and there's no resources dedicated to them. Yeah. There were a few that happened, quite a few actually, when big CPG dipped down to where like traditional, call it private equity, would play to start acquiring. It created a little bit of a flurry.
Yeah. And there are a couple of examples that have done exceptionally well, but they're the outlier. The ones that have done exceptionally well tend to be the businesses that were, 100 or 200 or 500 million in revenue. Because the big companies are really good at taking, Stacy's pita chips national overnight because it's a chip in a bag that fits on their truck. When you have somebody, and I won't pick on anybody in specific, but they go a smidgen outside their core and they do it with a really small business. Those are two recipes that probably lead to a divestiture down the road or unfortunately a business being shuttered later. Yeah.
I think you're right. I think you're exactly right. All right. Well, then let's get into the way you think about investing in brands and in these emerging brands. Because I think getting in your head, I think a lot of people are intimidated whenever they start to have conversations with potential investors or venture capital funds. I know I was early on, and you end up in a scenario where you kind of like put together a deck, you make a pitch, you field a bunch of questions, and then you feel like you're fighting for your life because you're just answering a bunch of questions. And then you say, okay, nice talking to you. You hang up the phone. And then you go, as the entrepreneur, you go, what the hell just happened? And you never really know what they're thinking. You never really know sort of like how they're thinking about anything. And so, not everybody is like that. But I think, I've had enough conversations over the years where like I've walked away and just my head has been spinning. And so I think this is an intimidating process in general.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe let's start with, at your fund specifically, when you set out to look for a potential brand to fit into your portfolio, I mean, what are your primary goals and what are you looking for and what are you typically looking to achieve?
Well, I'm not sure if you're talking about return or other things, but let me try and break it two separate ways.
Okay.
Institutional investors are different from people investing their own capital, whether it's families or individuals. I think the latter bucket, families and individuals, have a lot more freedom, a lot more wild cards, longer hold periods. As a broad overstatement, they don't need to be quite diversified, et cetera. So for institutional investors, I'm probably not going to invest in multiple businesses in the same category. So there is something to be said for, a portfolio construction. Now, that said, we're not just operating on one fund forever. We're investing out of our third fund, and the portfolio construction within a fund, we could have multiple businesses in the same space over funds. So it is important to understand that little caveat. But portfolio construction is important. Okay. For us, there's a little bit of difference in stage. Now, we only do emerging brands. We only do CPG. We don't do restaurants. We don't do retail. There are a bunch of things we don't do. We don't do alcoholic beverages. We don't do CBD. We don't do durables. We don't do apparel. So we know what we do and we know what we don't do. Some people have a much broader charter and it's much more opportunistic. We're very focused in what in the grand scheme of the GDP is a very narrow bucket. I mean, of course, it's not in the world we live in, but so fitting into the charter, for lack of a better phrase, is important. If you're looking for a $50 million check, or you're looking for a restaurant investor, we're neither of those. So, and we're also not a $250,000 seed investor. So understanding who you're talking to is important. And the reason this is so important is, as an entrepreneur, the most valuable thing, sure, money's worth something, but your time is worth a lot more. So you got to talk to the right people. And while I might be a nice guy, and I might be helpful someday, the right time to talk to me if you're raising $500,000 is not when you're deep in the middle of a $500,000 raise, because I'm not going to do it. It's when you're not raising and we say hi on some other aspect. Then I think you may have been asking about return expectations. When you're selling to a retailer, you need to understand what their metrics are, and you can't think about growing your business. You need to think about growing their category. And certain retailers have certain metrics like, profit per linear foot or other things. You need to understand what your buyer is thinking. Well, we're no different. You need to understand, what am I looking for? And if you're a really large fund writing a big check, a 3x return on your money is really interesting. If you're a seed investor or a pre-revenue or a classic venture investor, it's a little bifurcated. Most of them are looking for, 10 or 20 because there's going to be a 10 or 20 times your money because there's going to be a bunch of zeros. And there's a few angels I know that want to roughly match the market and have fun doing it, which is a much lower return threshold. So if you're looking for a seed investor, those two perspectives are really different. For us and most what I would call growth-oriented investors, think about 1x per year that they're invested. That's a crude, and it might be half to 3/4, or it might be 1.5, but good rule of thumb maybe is 1x per year somebody's invested. Remember, on the 10 or 20x, part of the reason they're looking for that is because they're going to have a lot of zeros.
Right.
Knock on wood, we've never had a zero. Mathematically, we will someday. I hope not soon. But we're less likely to have a 10 or a 20x, but hopefully not a zero. And if we can have a whole bunch of 3, 4, 5, maybe an occasional 2 times our money on the one that didn't quite go as planned, that's a win for us.
Yep.
So 1x per year is a good rule of thumb.
Got it. So a couple of things I want to just recap and make sure that
Sure.
I got them correctly. And then I think there's something in here I want to unpack. So I think, understanding who you're talking to and what they're looking for is really important. So I would say do your research up front. Know what their portfolio construction looks like. Do some, if you're talking to a more institutional investor, know what, are they already invested in your category? What size checks they write? What stage does your brand need to be? So knowing that up front sounds like it's really important so that nobody's
really
wasting
important.
anybody's.
And it's not hard to learn. Almost all this stuff's out there on the web. Most institutional investors are fund-based, and as a result, the size of their fund is easy to determine. A typical check size, if it's not on their homepage or 1 or 2 clicks, it's easy to learn about. Do your homework. Don't rush to call investor X until you've done your homework. There are plenty of people that you can ask about, whether it be other entrepreneurs, bankers, consultants, accountants. Don't rush out to call somebody until you've got a little sense of, are you a fit? Why are you a fit? Et cetera. And certainly don't just cold call if you don't have to.
Really good advice. And you said something a second ago that I think is really important and I think people miss. And, I think it's really hard to do when you're in the thick of entrepreneurship and dig in trenches. But you said the right time to talk to you is when you're not raising.
Absolutely.
The
best time to talk to a lender is when you don't need their money. The best time to talk to an investor is when you don't need their money. There's no time pressure. You can get to know people. You can tell your story informally. The guys at the mega funds that are writing $50 and $100 million check, they'll take your call often. It's a waste of time if you're raising $1 million or $5 million. So it's really more about setting the table for the future. And they might introduce you to somebody interesting that's more relevant. Time is valuable.
Yeah. So we're at this weird intersection, and I run across people who view business differently. I'm a relationship guy, always have been. I felt like, the reason that I would see any success in life is because I believe in building strong, long-term relationships with people.
Yeah, and we met for the first time in 2017.
Yeah, and so here we are. And so I believe in that. But there are people who don't. There are people who are very transaction oriented. There are people who say, where are you going to get the best deal? Just go do that. And
right.
And so,
by the way, that works on both sides. There are transactional entrepreneurs and there are transactional investors. So that's not unique to the entrepreneur side.
So perfect. So, but you would say from your perspective, building the relationship in advance of ever having an actual need puts you in probably the strongest position
absolutely.
To get it. Yeah. Okay.
It doesn't mean that you can't be successful going to talk to a cadre of folks and getting an investment, but there's nothing better than having 5 interactions over a year or 2 versus trying to cram those 5 into 90 days.
Yep. Got it. Okay. Very good. Thank you. That was, those are really good golden nuggets that I want to make sure we get out there. So how do you think about, because the other mystery when it comes to fundraising, is valuation. Oh. And I think everyone thinks about it a little differently. And there's an art and a science that I've experienced. But how do you think about it? And is there kind of a rule of thumb that entrepreneurs should have? Because sometimes entrepreneurs, well, not sometimes, almost every time an entrepreneur is going to overvalue their business. And so I guess how should we frame our minds as entrepreneurs and building brands about how, call it growth investors are thinking about valuation?
Yeah. Well, you're exactly right. There's a whole bunch of art and a little bit of science. And I'll put this out there and then sort of leave it because this could take us down a 30-minute rabbit hole. But in isolation, and that's a really important comment, valuation is irrelevant because if you tell me what your valuation wants to be, I can get there 100% of the time with structure and other kinds of stuff that complicate deals, and might work. But I think a fair, clean structure is better than one with a lot of structure. For those that aren't familiar with structure, things like preference, et cetera. I'll leave that, and that might be a topic for another day. But assuming you're dealing with a relatively clean structure, there is no fact. There's no question that valuations definitely moved up on emerging brands, and part of it was supply and demand. The big companies were dipping down with large valuations, so entrepreneurs and investors were sort of doing the same. Plus, there was a ton of money from outside the space. A valuation in a tech business has nothing to do with 1 or 3 or 5 times revenue. You can have $1 billion business valuation in the tech world in a business with $3 million of revenue. That's just normal in some ways. It doesn't apply to CPG. And there was some oddities that came in. But let's also be really clear. Let's not pretend that valuation isn't important to founders. In a way, it's sort of how they keep score, which is totally a fair thing. I think great businesses, and we'll talk about that, are entitled to the high end of a reasonable range. Now, once you get out of that reasonable range, a $5 or a $10 million revenue business, I have trouble finding that the reasonable range was ever or should have ever been in the 5 or 10 times revenue, let alone some of these businesses that did higher. But, if you're in a reasonable range, a great business should get some high end of a fair range. That said, I know this is hard, but if you're raising $100 million, valuation is really sensitive. The math is important. If you're raising a normal amount of capital for a CPG-oriented emerging brand, valuation is not that sensitive. Let me give you an example. If somebody is raising $3 and wants a $10 pre-money, someone or a group of somebodies is going to own 3/13, which is about 23% of the company. Okay. If somebody shaves that valuation by 1/3, so now they're raising 3 at 6 2/3 instead of at 10, somebody or a group of somebody is going to own, 3 divided by a little under 10 or about 30%. So we're talking about the difference of 7 points. Some people would say, oh my God, that's huge. I think most, especially when you have that 7 points spread over a bunch of seed investors, 2 founders, it's half a point for a whole lot of people. You got to decide what's important. But I can tell you factually, mathematically, it rarely matters. If it goes really well, all's good. If it doesn't go so good, doesn't matter. There are mathematically a small number of cases where that difference of the 7 points makes a huge difference. And you got to remember, somebody that's writing a check, an institutional investor, not necessarily an individual, they have to meet return expectations. So, if they're going to squeeze the valuation part of the balloon either pops and you're done talking, or the air goes somewhere else and they get their return some other way, preference or something. So at the end of the day, Sure, valuation matters, but I always encourage people to focus on, is this the right partner? Is it somebody you want to spend time with? Life is too short to work with assholes. I just, get the capital, do it in the right way, and build a great business, because fundraising is a huge distraction and not a core skill for 98% of the entrepreneurs I've met.
Yeah, nailed it. I think in my experience, what you just said is maybe the most important thing. Who you build with matters even more so than what you're building. And I think that sometimes that's overlooked. I think whether that's entrepreneurs looking to get a bigger deal or a better valuation, right, or because they're focused there, or it's like, hey, they'll just take the first check that someone offers them, and
right.
not really do their homework on who this person is or group of people are, and do they fit well together? I think
right.
that's really important.
I agree.
So how long then? That's a really good segue to the next question. In many cases, like, let's assume you and I are going to do a deal together and you're going to invest in my brand. How long should I think about our relationship lasting in business? Like, is there a typical timeline where a fund like yours is looking to hold a brand before they kind of, whether they exit that brand in the portfolio or whatever? Is there a typical timeline we should be thinking about?
Look, I mean, real, truly sustainable value generally isn't created overnight. So a 2-year hold for an investor, unless it's a very sort of advanced emerging brand, is probably not realistic. And most institutional investors are not signing up for 8 or 10 years. Broad overstatement, I'd think 4 to 7 years is a reasonable time horizon. Most investors don't want to talk about 7 years because they'd rather talk about, 3, 4, 5, knowing it's going to be longer.
Yeah.
But, making sure you and your investors, the entrepreneur and their investors, are aligned on time frame is important. And it's one of the topics that often doesn't come up, surprisingly. And also, interestingly, we often find entrepreneurs have a shorter time horizon than we think is reality. So we may actually have a longer time horizon than they do.
Yeah.
Maybe just, we've seen aspects of the movie before, but it takes a while.
Yeah. I had a conversation, actually it's timely, it's 1 year ago today. I had a conversation with the baseball player, Alex Rodriguez, the former baseball player, who has become a kind of a perennial entrepreneur in himself and
right.
has makes lots of investments, but got the privilege of meeting him, spending a little bit of time together. And the one piece of advice, or the one phrase that he said that stuck with me that I haven't let go of, was build like you're building for 30 years, not 3. And I think most entrepreneurs, I think especially ones with good ideas, that we overestimate what we can do in the short term, and we underestimate what it's going to take in the long term. And I think we should just reframe our mindsets to think about, okay, if I were building for the next 30 years, what decision would I make today? And I think that changes the perspective a lot.
I think that's right. And by the way, there are investors that are really great at stage here, and other investors that are great at stage here. And maybe these investors take out these investors and it keeps going. And we've been part of that, both in taking out some earlier stage investors and having been taken out by later stage investors.
Yeah. So I think it's a really important question for people to ask up front in the discussion. And it's, how long do you guys typically like to have a brand in your portfolio? And I think it's really important to align on that timeline up front. Yeah. Agreed. So, all right. So then I've got a couple of kind of more tactical questions, and we can rapid fire these a little bit, but what are some, two-part question. What are some common mistakes entrepreneurs make when approaching investors? And then what are some must-haves in your pitch or in your deck that entrepreneurs need to have when speaking to investors?
All right, let me take those in reverse order.
Okay, perfect.
I think the reason I'm going to do that is because it's all about a reason to believe. Now, the reason to believe for a pre-revenue idea is very different than the reason to believe for a $50 million revenue business on its way to 75 or 100. Obviously, a pre-revenue business has no marketplace facts, doesn't have much financial metrics. The other end of the spectrum will have oodles. But fundamentally, it's all about a reason to believe. People are welcome to visit the loftgrowthpartners.com site. We've got a ton of entrepreneur resources, interestingly, in a section called resources. And one of them is 5 things to say to investors. And I personally think these 5 things apply with different support, whether you're pre-revenue or you're 50 million. So I'll just sort of throw these 5 out and people can look them up online. Number 1, we have a differentiated approach to blank. In an ideal world, that blank is a large and growing category. Nobody wants to be part of a declining and teeny category. So if you can say we have a differentiated approach, nobody wants a me too, differentiated approach in a large and growing category, that's point number 1. Number 2 is we're doing well. So if you're pre-revenue, you're doing well is the product's formulated, we're ready to go, we've had discussions, with a couple retailers, whatever it is. If you're on the other end of the spectrum, you've got real marketplace data, you've got sell-through, you've got great margins, you got whatever. So we're doing well. That's point number 2. Number 3 is we're just getting cooking. So whether that's growth, margins, profitability, whatever it is, it's even if we're doing well and we're 50, we're just at the beginning. The future's so bright, you got to wear shades. So that's point number 3. Number 4 is we're the ones to pull this off. Or if you're pre-revenue and it's you, it's I'm the one to pull this off. So this is something about you as an individual, as an entrepreneur, as a team. If you're solo, it's, I'm the right person to do this and then build a team around me, or we have a sophisticated team, whatever it is, it's we're the people to pull this off. And number 5 is the potential for you is huge. Got to think about it from their perspective. Got to be careful. Don't be naive that this is the last capital because, when things are going well, it takes a little more capital. When things hit a bump, it takes more capital. So my rule of thumb is it always takes a little more capital. So you got to factor in future capital dilution, whatever. But those are the 5 simple thoughts that I encourage people to talk to investors about. And you may have what I jokingly call the money chart. Don't know what the money chart is depending on the business, but there's an example or 2 in that resource section. If you're a $5 or a $10 million emerging brand or $3 million and you got 30% distribution in the natural channel and 2% in conventional because you got like 2 retailers and your velocities are off the damn charts on teeny little distribution, and you can show how your velocities compare to like the mega brand. Now, most emerging brands can't show this chart because they're not outselling on a per door basis the big guy. And I mean on a per SKU basis because they're probably the big guy's probably got a ton of SKUs and you probably have 3 or whatever. But whatever your money chart is, everybody needs a money chart. Sometimes it's velocity, sometimes it's Amazon sell-through, sometimes it's repeat, sometimes it's, oh my God, we're a food business with 55% gross margins on a true gross margin basis. You know how important gross margins are to me. And whatever your money chart is, have one.
Got it.
Now, going to the mistakes.
Yeah.
I get the ones that come in cold over the transom. It's a running joke. But I once got this three-minute voicemail. Well, kind of, we're looking for some money for sort of a food product. I'm not sure if you do that. And it wandered for 3 minutes and I'm like, delete. Second is, don't dance around NDAs. Just get into the discussion. I tell people, even at $30 and $50 million, don't worry about NDAs, certainly not up front. First, investors are not in the business of stealing your ideas and starting new businesses. That's just not their gig. Second, if somebody can duplicate your business from a PowerPoint or an Excel, you got bigger problems. And you're not giving people your formulas or anything like that, certainly not early on. So just get into the discussion. The last thing you need to do is spend 2 weeks negotiating an NDA. So anyway, so that's number two. So some people will get way into the weeds on the wrong topics, and others will skim across the top. It's a delicate balance of finding the right balance of giving enough information. Remember, your goal is not to get a check in the first conversation. Your goal, because that isn't going to happen, your goal is to have a second conversation with somebody that's interested.
Goal is to get the second conversation. A mentor of mine once said, you've got to have a good balance of steak and sizzle.
Absolutely.
And so you can't have too much of either.
Yeah. And, I started my career at large company marketer background. Us marketers are the worst offenders. There's a lot of sizzle in the entrepreneurs that were marketers in a former life and not a lot of steak. Sometimes they forget to say how it's made, the fact that we can make money on this thing, et cetera. So it needs to be a balance of, reason to believe on the consumer, reason to believe on the financials, reason to believe on a bunch of things.
Got it.
And one last thing, while we're all excited about, the mega deals of yesterday of Burt's Bees and Vitamin Water, or the more recent mega deals like Siete, those are extreme outliers. If all of the comps you talk about are the mega unrealistic, those are 1, 2, 4 a year. They're not most people. So, most of us roll our eyes when we see the comps on, Burt's Bees or more recently things like Siete.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you put that in the context of an Expo West, given the timing there's 4,500, 5,000 brands representative there, and maybe 1 or 2 mega deals a year from brands who have put in. I mean, Siete's put in 15 years.
Yeah,
it wasn't an overnight. I mean, they were successful kind of out of the gate if we're measuring what we consider success to be, but they've been building for a long time.
Absolutely. Yeah. And by the way, there are very few mega exits that go from nothing to mega exit in 3 to 5 years. They're all a long run.
So would you say, that's a good point. So I think that's a myth. And I'd love to get your take on another one, but I think that's a common myth when it comes to building a business, particularly in CPG, is that you can go from zero to mega exit in 3 to 5 years. I think that's I don't know where people got that in their head. There were a few brands that RX Bar, I think, was very fast, but that almost never happens.
Yeah. And very fast was probably 7 to 10 years. It wasn't 3. Because I was living in Chicago at the time and knew the guys, and they're impressive as hell, and kudos to them. But it wasn't 3 years. So I think that's right.
Yeah, that's fair. Okay. All right. Then I've just got a couple of quick last couple of questions that I want to make sure that you and I get to. And by the way, I'm going to link to that resource on your website when we publish this.
It's easy to find.
It's an invaluable resource that I wish I had over the years. All right. Two last questions. One, why don't funds like yours hire more operators?
The honest answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
The vast majority of investors are former bankers or former consultants. And those are great backgrounds. These people are so far up the smart curve. I don't know the answer to your question. Now, I'm a little jaded. We're a small team, but we're 100% operators with very diverse backgrounds, large companies, having been CEOs of emerging brands, cross-functionally background. Even one ran a co-packer for 9 years. So I don't know the answer. And by the way, I'll just editorialize and rant for a quick second. I'm also surprised there's not more female investors. CPG is a category where, regardless of who the consumer is, whether it's the baby or a male or a teen, the vast majority of purchasing in this CPG land is still females. So it's mind-boggling to me that there aren't more females as well as operators. We happen to be 60% female, which is also 2 of the 3 partners, not just sort of the 20-something associate. Yep. So the honest answer is I don't know. It makes so much sense. But there are phenomenally successful investors that don't have operators or don't have many of them, so it works for them. So I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Look, I just think from my seat, like if I were an investor, if I was sitting on your side of the table, I would think that an enormous value add to bring to a conversation would be, we have a bench of operators on our team that can help you solve supply chain problems, that can dig in and build financial models, that can dig in and help you go create that relationship there, sell that product in, build that deck. I just think that, like, and I don't devalue, right? They're brilliant consultants and financial guys out there. They're brilliant and they're helpful.
I agree.
And so I don't devalue that. I just think I would overvalue the operator's experience, because I know that they could, they relate to me in a way that others can't. And I think that matters. I think the way we relate to each other really does matter. And I don't know, maybe in a second life, if I ever decide to go start a fund one day, that'll be my secret sauce. It'll just be a team of operators only, and go down that path.
Yep.
So, okay. Right. Well, final and most fun question that I have. So we've known each other now for 8 years.
Yeah.
And I'll set this up with, I was going through a really hard time personally in 2017 when I decided to go out and start a fundraising round. And at the time, my mom was in the hospital and her health was failing, and I had to go down to Florida, and I spent a month in the ICU with her. But simultaneously, we still had a business that was running, and I had made some relationships with people over time, met people at these expos and things. You and your team were one of them, and I started making some phone calls, just to keep my brain occupied and sort of distracted, I think, and said, hey, we're going to have to go raise some money in the future. Let's start talking. And I walked away from our first discussion thinking, man, I really like their approach. I really like the way they do things. This would be like, I feel a lot of synergies here. In the end, we didn't do anything together from a business perspective. So I'll ask this question. It's loaded. But I think this will be really valuable for a lot of entrepreneurs. What was it? Why didn't the deal work out between us? Why did it end up, not happening?
Yeah. So why'd we turn you down? I think there's a bunch of reasons. From day one, I wasn't the only person that met you on our team, but everybody loved you. But there were a bunch of things going on in the business, and in no particular order, being super direct. And I shared this with you mostly at the time, almost all of it or all of it, because we don't just try and say, sorry, not the right time. It's a broad overstatement. Investors don't say no, they say not now, which isn't helpful to entrepreneurs. So you were about 5 million run rate, not even trailing at the time. And you were looking to raise 5 million, which we thought was too much to raise at the time. I know it's weird for people in my line of work to say, don't raise as much, take it slower. But part of it was, whether you're a seasoned entrepreneur like, John Foraker, who I was with earlier this week, or Seth Goldman, or anybody else, they all make mistakes in the second and third and fourth business. I can be 100% assured you're going to make mistakes too. And if you have too much money, make expensive mistakes. If you don't have a lot of money, make cheap mistakes. So one was, we thought you were raising too much money. That was number one. Number two was, you were looking at the time, and we were candid, and we had this conversation, and it wasn't acrimonious, but you were looking for a pretty premium valuation that we weren't going to be able to get to. For lots of reasons. Your gross margins were not ready for prime time yet. As I recall, they were in the mid to high 20s. That was not ready for prime time. There were a lot of questions about where your portfolio was. I look back at some of the materials. You were in 4 categories to get you to the 5 million run rate, and launching 2 more as we were talking. So you were going to be in 6 categories, and you were hoping to go from $5 million run rate to a little under 10 the next year. There were a lot of questions on the portfolio. And when you were looking for a pretty premium valuation, we just weren't going to get there. But instead of just saying no, we proposed a 2-step valuation where you raise a little bit less money now, and then a little bit more at a higher valuation. And we were willing to sort of structure that with you. At the end of the day, the difference in ownership was 2.9 points between raising all 5 at a premium versus a little bit less and a little bit more in a 2-step. And that didn't work for you. And we weren't offended, because it's got to work for you. It wasn't the right time and place.
Yep.
And it didn't develop into the right time and place, despite the fact that we talk to each other and see each other at least several times a year.
Yep.
But, it wasn't the right time. And I think you were raising a little bit more money than you probably needed to at the time, and maybe an economics that we couldn't get to. So that's we had this conversation then, but that's the very direct answer for other people to hear.
So I think these are really valuable lessons, and one that I've learned, that I always learn from things that I would consider mistakes or opportunities. And I think, my first conversations ever around, with individual investors was, everyone told me I was raising too little. And then I think my mindset shifted of like, when I'll go raise more, the more you're looking to raise, the more you'll attract people, because then they'll take you more seriously. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle of that. The pendulum swung really hard. I think the valuation conversation that you and I had earlier really resonates here, because this is where setting the right expectations. It's one thing to believe in yourself. It's one thing to believe in what you're building and know that you put a high value on that. It's another thing to know that if you're outside of what would be the reasonable range of the valuation based on the stage you're at today. And to your point, this isn't tech. And then, the one lesson I learned, I think call it the hard way, but I think most entrepreneurs have 1,000 ideas floating through their head, and they want to execute on all of them all at the same time. And I think it's really hard. I think one of the most difficult things to do as an entrepreneur is remain disciplined towards your core. And so I think another lesson people can take away from this one is, stay focused on the core and not necessarily on expanding categories, because, I wanted to go disrupt as many aisles as I could. And we did a pretty good job disrupting a handful of aisles. It was pretty solid. But I think that our core business suffered because of it. And we delayed some growth, and we delayed some focus because of that. And then I think, it made us look a little bit disorganized or just sort of scattered. And I think, there's a sentiment sometimes that investors are always looking for a straight shot down the fairway, and that doesn't matter. I think showing that you're focused and that you have a drive towards sort of like a singular goal, I think can be really valuable. And most of us want to get really wide. And so I think if I were to build a business, if I were to go do 2.0 of whatever's next for me, it'd be, I'd take my handful of core products in one single category and I would just crush that until, and I wouldn't even consider the next category, even the next product, until that core was just on fire. And I think that's a really valuable lesson.
Said for that. And, I think I've mentioned this to you before. I've certainly said this to others. I had the privilege of working for, I think, the smartest person in this industry, big company person. And when I was working for her, she had something like 30,000 employees at Kraft. And she said to me, we can do anything, but we can't do everything. And that has stuck with me, like she said it this morning. If you're an emerging brand with 6 or 10 or 20 people, you certainly can't do everything. And you definitely still can't do anything because you're a small company. So you got to pick your battles. You got to do the right things, and focus is really important. And what you decide not to do is sometimes the most important set of decisions.
I can't think of a better note to wrap this conversation up on. I mean, you just nailed it. I don't even want to say anything else because that was like the perfect summary to the entire discussion. Andy, thank you for being with me today and spending time having this discussion.
Sure, my pleasure.